Two German officers walk up the road toward the American lines outside Bastogne on the morning of December 22, 1944, carrying a white flag and a folded typewritten note. They are met by a squad from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, blindfolded with strips of a spare parachute, and walked back through the mud and the snow to a farmhouse the paratroopers are using as a battalion command post. The note in their pocket is addressed to the American commander in the town. It gives him 2 hours to surrender the garrison, and it promises, in plain-typed English, the total annihilation of every man inside if he does not. The note reaches Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe about noon. He reads it twice. He is a mild-looking artilleryman from the regular army, who has been in charge of the 101st Airborne Division for less than a week, and what he says when he finally answers will become the single most famous word an American commander has ever spoken in the field. He says it almost by accident. His staff makes sure the Germans hear it exactly. To understand how a note like that came to be walked up an American road with 2 hours attached to it, you have to go back 6 days. On the 16th of December, in a thick, cold fog before dawn, 3 German armies had come out of the Ardennes forest and hit the thinnest, quietest stretch of the American line in Belgium. It was the last great German offensive of the war, Hitler's personal gamble, the plan that would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. The idea was to punch through a weakly held sector, race to the Meuse River, cross it, and drive on to the port of Antwerp. If it worked, the American and British armies in northern Belgium would be cut in half and forced into a second Dunkirk. If it failed, Germany had nothing left. 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks had been massed in secrecy under the fog and the trees, and the American units in the Ardennes had almost no warning that any of it was coming. For the first 2 days, it worked. Green infantry divisions holding that stretch of line were overrun or driven back. Whole regiments were captured in the woods. Roads became rivers of retreating vehicles, and a huge, shapeless bulge began to swell westward into the Allied front. But there was one place in the middle of that bulge where 7 paved roads came together, in a small Belgian market town on a plateau, and every one of those roads mattered. If the Germans took the town, their tanks could pour west on hard surfaces built to carry weight. If the Germans did not take it, their armoured columns had to leave the roads and grind through frozen mud and steep forest tracks that would burn fuel they could not replace. The town was Bastogne. The whole German timetable ran through it. They came in on trucks through the dark. The 101st Airborne Division had been in reserve at Mourmelon in France after the fighting in Holland, resting and refitting, missing men and equipment, waiting for replacements that had not yet arrived. Their commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington for a conference and could not be reached in time. So the division moved out under its senior artilleryman, a quiet, regular army brigadier named Anthony McAuliffe, who had never before commanded a division in the field and had less than a day to prepare. They loaded onto open trucks in freezing rain and drove north through the night for 100 miles across France and into Belgium. Many of the paratroopers had no winter overcoats. Many had no gloves. Many carried only the ammunition they had grabbed off the depot floor on the way out. Ahead of them, a smaller American force was already in Bastogne and holding the outskirts. A combat command of the 10th Armoured Division, under Colonel William Roberts, sent up from Patton's Third Army, had reached the town on the 18th and split into 3 small task forces to plug the roads east and northeast. Those tankers bought the paratroopers a day. They fought delaying actions at Neuville and Longvilly and Wardin, and they were ground down doing it. But every hour they held east of Bastogne was an hour the 101st had to dig in. The paratroopers began arriving on the 19th, jumping down off trucks in the snow, forming up in a market square where officers pointed them at map coordinates and told them to go and hold. By the night of the 20th, they held a rough perimeter 16 miles around. By the 21st, the Germans had closed the last road behind them, and Bastogne was surrounded. What formed inside that ring was a garrison of about 18,000 Americans, drawn from half a dozen outfits that had never trained together. There were paratroopers from the 4 regiments of the 101st, there were the tankers of the 10th Armoured, and the tank destroyers of the 705th. There were African-American gunners of the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, who would fight so hard in the coming days that they earned a Distinguished Unit Citation, the first ever given to a black artillery unit in the war. There were engineers and stragglers from broken units to the east, and cooks and clerks with rifles. McAuliffe put them all under the same map and let his regimental commanders sort them out. What they did not have was air support, because a low grey overcast sat on top of Belgium and the transport planes and fighter bombers could not fly. What they did not have was much artillery ammunition. What they did not have was warm clothing, and what they did not have was any obvious way out. Around them, closing in from 4 directions, was a force built to take a town like Bastogne apart. It included the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, the elite Panzer Lehr Division of General Fritz Bayerlein, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, the paratroopers of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, and later the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and the Führer-Begleit Brigade. On paper, it was 6 German divisions closing on a single American Airborne Division and its attachments. The commanders leading them had come out of Russia and the Normandy fighting, and they had every reason to believe that a surrounded American force with no air cover, almost no armor of its own, and dwindling ammunition would do what surrounded forces almost always did. It would negotiate. It would give up. It would collapse. That was the assumption the German Corps commander made when he wrote his note on the morning of the 22nd. It was the assumption that ran into a wall no one on the German side had seen coming. The Corps commander was General Heinrich von Luttwitz, a heavy-set Prussian in his 50s, who ran the XLVI Panzer Corps and had ordered the encirclement completed. It was his staff who typed the note, and his signature that travelled up the road under the white flag. The 2 officers who carried it were a major and a lieutenant from Panzer Lehr, both fluent enough in English to make the terms clear. They walked out of a wooded stretch south of Bastogne at about 11:30 in the morning and were spotted almost at once by a squad of the 327th Glider Infantry on the perimeter. A sergeant named Carl Dickinson and a medic named Ernest Premetz met them, and the Germans held out their white flag and asked to be taken to the American commander. They were blindfolded with strips of parachute silk and walked back through the American positions to the battalion command post, and from there their note travelled up the chain to the acting commander of the 101st Airborne, who was resting in the basement of an old Belgian army barracks in the centre of the town. The note, once translated in front of him, was a formal military ultimatum in the old European style. It stated that Bastogne was encircled by strong German armoured units. It stated that further American resistance would result in the total annihilation of the garrison, along with civilian casualties in the town. It offered honourable surrender terms, to be answered within 2 hours. It was the kind of document a Prussian corps commander might have written to a beaten opponent in the wars of the previous century, and it assumed, in every line, that the American in the basement would read it and understand that his situation was hopeless. It took most of a working day to get every name and unit in this story right, because the version that circulates online usually says the surrender demand came from the SS, and it did not. It came from a Wehrmacht Panzer Corps. If this is the history you want more of, told properly, hit like. 1 like is enough. McAuliffe read it once and made a small sound that his staff officers heard as something between a laugh and a snort. What he said out loud, according to the men in the room, was, "Or, nuts." He set the note aside, and he began to think about what a formal written answer to a formal written ultimatum should look like, because that was how the thing was done. And it was his operations officer, a young lieutenant colonel named Harry Kinnard, who spoke up and said, "Sir, that first remark of yours would be hard to beat." McAuliffe looked at him. He asked what he had said. Kinnard said, "You said nuts." McAuliffe thought about it. He nodded. He told them to type it up. The reply that came out of the typewriter was 4 lines long. To the German commander. Nuts. The American commander. It was carried down through the perimeter to the same wooded stretch by Colonel Joseph Harper, who commanded the 327th, and it was handed to the same 2 German officers, still under white flag, and still with polite Prussian formality. They read it again, and one of them looked up at Harper and asked in careful English whether the answer was affirmative or negative. Harper had spent the walk out to the trees turning the word over in his head, and he had his translation ready. He told the German officer that if he did not know what nuts meant, in plain English it was the same thing as go to hell, and he told him that if the German commander persisted in his attack, every American gun in Bastogne would kill every one of them. The Germans saluted stiffly, turned, and walked back to their lines. Harper walked back to his. Both sides now knew what came next. What came next was the heaviest fighting of the siege. Through the 23rd and 24th, German attacks hit the perimeter from 3 sides at once. Tank-led columns coming out of the fog with infantry behind them, aiming for the seams between the American regiments. The paratroopers and the tank destroyers stopped them yard by yard in villages whose names most Americans have never heard, at Marvy and at Champs and at Hemroul. On Christmas Eve, German aircraft bombed the town itself, killing wounded men in an aid station in a Belgian convent. And still the ring held. Hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is the fastest armoured relief drive of the war, one of Patton's tank battalions punching a hole through the German lines from 90 degrees off its previous axis of advance. 2 things had already changed on the American side by then, and both mattered. The first was the weather. On the 23rd, the low overcast that had grounded the Allied air forces since the offensive began finally lifted, and the sky over Belgium went clear and cold and blue. C-47 transports out of England began flying supply runs into Bastogne within hours, and pathfinders on the ground marked the drop zones with coloured panels. Bundles of ammunition and food and medical supplies came down under white parachutes into the fields around the town, and the men in the foxholes cheered as they fell. Fighter bombers came with them. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed the German columns closing on the perimeter, breaking up attacks before they formed. The second thing was farther off, and the men inside Bastogne could not yet see it. Patton's Third Army was coming. Patton had turned 3 of his divisions 90 degrees to the north on the 19th, and had promised General Eisenhower that he could hit the southern flank of the German Bulge with an attack in 3 days. Almost no one at that meeting believed him. He did it in 3 days. His spearhead was the 4th Armoured Division, and its spearhead was the 37th Tank Battalion under a young lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, who would one day give his name to an American main battle tank. On the afternoon of the 26th of December, Abrams' tanks fought their way through the last German positions south of Bastogne at the village of Assenois, and the first Sherman into the American perimeter was commanded by a lieutenant named Charles Boggess. He saw a paratrooper of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion coming out of a foxhole toward him and called out to ask if he was glad to see them. The paratrooper reportedly said, "I sure am." Bastogne was no longer surrounded. The siege had lasted 8 days. The 101st and its attachments had lost close to 2,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing. They had held a road hub the entire German offensive had been built to seize, and by holding it, they had strangled the offensive from the inside. Every panzer division that had to leave the roads and grind through the woods around Bastogne burned more fuel and lost more time than the plan could afford. The German advance never reached the Meuse. It never got close. By the middle of January, the Bulge had been erased, and the Wehrmacht that had come out of the fog on the 16th of December had spent the last of its offensive strength. The men of the 101st, when they were pulled out at last, told anyone who asked that they had never needed rescuing. They had been the ones surrounding the Germans, they said. They had just been surrounding them in all directions at once. What McAuliffe had actually said in that basement on the 22nd of December was not really the word itself. It was what the word carried. The Germans had sent a formal note in the old style, because they assumed they were dealing with an army that still played by the old rules of surrender, an army that could be told its situation was hopeless and would agree. McAuliffe answered in 1 syllable, because there was nothing else to say. His men were not going to negotiate. They were not going to leave. They were not going to break. They were going to stand in the snow around a Belgian market town and outlast a German offensive that had been years in the planning, and they were going to do it hungry and cold and outnumbered 6-1. The word was the shortest possible way of saying all of that. And when the two German officers walked back to their lines carrying it, they were carrying, though they did not yet know it, the news that the last German offensive of the war had already failed. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications for the next one. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you there.